Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas in his Catholic faith. This is day 66. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 10 and 11 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the manner in which the will is moved, and of enjoyment, which is an act of the will. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether the will is moved to anything naturally. Do we will anything as a result simply of our nature, based on the nature of the will itself, as well as human nature? And the answer is yes. We will goods, since that is the proper object of the will, the good. In general, like the power of sight, is directed to color in general. We also naturally will our own happiness, as we proved in episodes 61 through 63. And lastly, we will those individual goods which belong to the perfection of our other faculties, as St. Thomas says. Man wills naturally not only the object of the will, but also other things that are appropriate to the other powers, such as the knowledge of truth, which befits the intellect, and to be, and to live, and other like things which regard the natural well-being, all of which are included in the object of the will. Article 2, whether the will is moved of necessity by its object. Is there a good out there which necessarily moves the will to will? To this question, Aquinas presents us with the power of sight as an instructional analogy. If the room is dark or my eyes are closed, I do not see anything. But when I open my eyes in a well-lit room, I necessarily see all the colored things within it. In the same way, when I think about something, when the intellect presents some object to my will, this would be like colored objects in a well-lit room, I necessarily will the thing if it is good in all respects. That would be happiness, or we can say God via the beatific vision. But if the good in question is not totally good, like a room not totally well lit, then just like I don't necessarily see all of that room, I do not necessarily will some partially good thing, but am free to will or not to will it. In St. Thomas's words, that good alone which is perfect and lacking in nothing is such a good that the will cannot not will it, and this is happiness, whereas any other particular good, insofar as they are lacking in some good, can be regarded as non-goods from this point of view. They can be set aside or approved by the will. Article 3, whether the will is moved of necessity by the lower appetite. Does sensual desire move the will to will necessarily? And it normally doesn't, unless Aquinas says a man be made momentarily insane or enraged to the point of blunting his use of reason, and therefore in a certain way can be compelled to choose something. But normally speaking, passions, anger, desire, sorrow, influence our will by making the object of our will, the particular good in question, in this brief, passionate state seem more fitting or suitable to us, more attractive to be willed, as we said in our last episode. Article 4, whether the will is moved of necessity by the exterior mover, which is God. In a word from St. Thomas, since therefore the will is an active principle, not determinate to one thing, but having an indifferent relation to many things, God so moves it, that he does not determine it of necessity to one thing, but its movement remains contingent and not necessary, except in those things to which it is moved naturally. In other words, God moves us as the unmoved mover of all things according to the kind of thing that we are. And we are a voluntary agent. And so he moves us to choose voluntarily, not out of a mechanical necessity, like stones falling, for instance. Plus, again, the only thing which we would necessarily, although still voluntarily, definitely will, would be that which we tend to by nature, i.e. our happiness, and that in which our happiness is certainly to be found, which is God via the beatific vision. Now on to question 11 on enjoyment. Article 1, whether to enjoy is an act of the appetitive power. The appetitive powers would include things like the will or sensual desire as contrasted with apprehensive powers like sight or the intellect. First of all, what is enjoyment? Augustine says to enjoy is to adhere lovingly to something for its own sake. And since the appetitive powers are directed towards the inner goal of our willing or desiring as something to be attained, it is most especially in the appetitive powers that enjoyment occurs, in this resting, in that good loved and sought for. But since joy must follow upon knowledge of things which are first loved, and then the knowledge of their subsequent attainment, the apprehensive powers, most especially the intellect, definitely have their part to play as well. St. Thomas says, bringing these two notions together, the following. In delight, there are two things: perception of what is becoming, and this belongs to the apprehensive power, and complacency in that which is offered as becoming, and this belongs to the appetitive power, in which power delight is formally completed. Article 2, whether to enjoy belongs to the rational creature alone or also to irrational animals. Enjoyment belongs to the rational nature in a perfect degree, to irrational animals imperfectly, to other creatures not at all, are the words of Aquinas on this topic. In order to enjoy the good goal attained, there must be some knowledge of that thing and its attainment. And since irrational creatures like the dog only have a sensitive, sensual knowledge of things, based on this imperfect apprehension of things, they can be said to have an imperfect enjoyment in the possession of them. But for us, the rational creature, by not only perceiving the particular desirable thing through the senses, but also in understanding what goodness is, what achievement and acquisition of some goal actually means, the fullness of enjoyment in the attainment of the good is to be found in us, the intellectual creatures. Article 3, whether enjoyment is only of the last end. Augustine says, a man does not enjoy that which he desires for the sake of something else, which is a thought worth praying about and utilizing in self-reflection, because spiritually speaking, we should desire everything temporal for the sake of the eternal, not for its own sake. Even as St. John of the Cross will say in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, there can be no joy, which is passion, where there is no habitual attachment in the heart. So we should ask ourselves, is it an attachment to sensual goods which allows one to find enjoyment in them? But going back to our article, St. Thomas argues that enjoyment is in the attainment of an end, yet there are relative ends as well as an ultimate end. Our ultimate end, which is happiness via the beatific vision, what we know by revelation, this is the only end in which we can find enjoyment in its fullest proper sense. But in relative ends, within that end or on the way to that end, there can truly be moments in which delight in some particular good attained is elicited, even if these on-the-way goods which we attain can only give an imperfect, incomplete enjoyment. St. Thomas captures this tension beautifully in the following words. We enjoy what we know when the delighted will is at rest therein, but its rest is not absolute, save in the possession of the last end. For as long as something is looked for, the movement of the will remains in suspense, although, or even if, it has reached something. Article 4 in our last article, whether enjoyment is only of the end possessed. And the operative word in this article is possessed. The question is whether we can enjoy some goal of ours even before we actually possess it. And the answer is yes. For example, true knowledge of God, even in this life, although it falls short of perfect possession of Him in the beatific vision, is not without its own enjoyment. Augustine's definition of happiness was joy in truth. And so think about the joy of contemplating God through His Word, through silent rest in His presence and prayer. As Aquinas says in response to this article, perfect enjoyment, therefore, is of the end already possessed, but imperfect enjoyment is also of the end possessed, not really, but only in intention, that is, in the mind. So even in this life, we can take hold of God by habitual grace, by prayer, by the sacraments, by the actual thought of God. We can say with the author of the Song of Songs. I found him, whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go. And that is all for questions 10 and 11 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the manner in which the will is moved and of enjoyment, which is an act of the will. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.